So welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and this is going to be maybe a little bit of a risk on my part because as I'm sure you can see, this is a night battle which tends to be a little bit more difficult to make work simply because night battles in Medieval 2 actually are pretty bloody dark, especially when you put them through the YouTube compression. But I think on this occasion we might just be a little bit... we might be okay. The ambient light here on TOL FALAS is not too bad, and that's actually the main reason why I'm going to be showing TOL FALAS again, because we haven't really seen it in the dark such as this. It definitely gives it a different atmosphere, doesn't it? So that's part of the reason we're going to be showing it. The theme today is that there is going to be a little bit of strife among the underlings of Sauron, with the forces of Khand coming here to try and wrest control of this valuable island away from the forces of Rhun. Neither of these two would be very well known for striking up naval invasions, but nonetheless here they are. Khand have always had maybe a little bit more of a predisposition in the lore to tend towards good, certainly more so than Rhun, who pretty much every time you see the Easterlings they are under someone's sway, be that dragons or Sauron forcing dominion upon them. But yes, should be a rather interesting battle this, because both factions have got largely the same kind of strengths when it comes to their infantry. Maybe Khand have got slightly more variation in their high tier infantry, whereas Rhun have got a little bit more so in terms of their ranged units, certainly with their crossbows and the like. So that's going to be a bit of a difference maker, and indeed those strengths favour the roles that both factions are taking up when it comes to attacking and defending today. But we'll go through the attackers first and foremost, as we often do, starting off with John over here, who is a very long way away from being able to attack into this position. And yes, this is the standard version of TOL FALAS where there are no pathways through the mountains, so he is going to have to march that entire way to meet up with his allies. Nomadic Axemen, basic unit of axes this. I mean, armor piercing will not go fully to waste against Rhun, though it won't be the value tour de force perhaps that you would expect it to be against many of the western kingdoms of men and the dwarves that can fairly commonly end up going up against. However, the Nurad footmen, while they too have that armor piercing focus, those big large rectangular wicker shields that they also have, means that they're going to be able to absorb a lot of the basic runic projectiles that are going to be coming their way. Of course, less so with regards to any javelins and crossbow bolts, but certainly in terms of basic arrow fire they will be pretty damn resilient. One of the main reasons why you would want to bring them in this kind of situation. The armor piercing though is a nice bonus to be sure. Brotherhood of the Shadows are here, of course, in terms of throwing projectiles. Khand are not completely without options either. The Brotherhood, as with most assassin class units, are fairly expensive for what they offer in the current version of the game, but they can offer a decent amount of burst damage, and if it does come down to a more isolated fight between individual infantry units, their very high melee defense can help see them through in that situation. But in more grindy fights, where their slightly more lightweight nature can be exploited, that can be a bit of a problem. When you're on the attack like this, there's no real avoiding the fact that you're going to have to march into the meat grinder at some point. Nomadic infantry, so the slightly heavier unit of skirmishing archers that Khand have at their disposal. They can double as half-decent line infantry as well, though their main focus here is going to be in trying to win the skirmish fight against Rhun, and these slightly heavier archers will allow them to do that. Rhun's archers are going to be maybe slightly more numerous, but certainly not as tanky as this kind of unit. They will have to worry about crossbows and the like, however, a few volleys from them and things could be getting pretty dangerous. Nurad halberds, of course, one of the things which Rhun and Khand both have in common is the fact that they rely on a fairly basic but certainly very efficient halberdier unit to be the anchor of their front lines, the Nurad halberds being that for the slightly more eastern of the two factions. Nurad halberds, plenty of them. Brotherhood of the Axe are the most aggressive of the Brotherhood units that Khand have at their disposal, obviously twinning armor piercing with a pretty damn decent base attack bonus as well, and like I said, armor piercing won't go entirely to waste against Rhun, though their lower focus on defense will mean that those runic projectiles will once again be fairly efficient against a unit like this. We've got more Nurad footmen. We've already seen in the background a fair few of these armor upgraded Variag warriors. When it comes to actually getting involved in melee, especially against the entry level runic units, should there be any, the Variag warriors will actually be pretty good. However, when it comes to facing off against some of the stronger runic offerings, I do feel as though their higher defensive values and a good defensive position will mean that the Variag warriors ultimately don't have the quality, the sheer quality level that many other heavy swordsmen do have in order to be able to start forcing Rhun back in the same way. So perhaps on this occasion their slightly lower tier nature in comparison to a lot of two-handed swordsmen will make them come unstuck. Some standard nomadic warriors, so very basic unit of sword and board infantry this. Not too dissimilar to the likes of Angmar Marauders and the like very entry-level, more numerous weapon and shield units that you see from many of the other evil factions, and it's nice that Khand do have this option, though, as with those other evil factions, they can often find themselves routing en masse as a result of sustained pressure. More of them back here, more nomadic infantry, and of course the incredibly powerful Nurad Storm Guard, by far and away the scariest Khandish infantry unit, a very unique kind of bodyguard unit in the game as well, with those long weapons, not too dissimilar to something like the Fountain Guard from Gondor, though, like I said, a bodyguard unit, so they do have that second hit point to work with as well. Rest of the Khandish armies, do we have any different units? We do, from Medexa, who's decided to bring the Hwacha, which does mean if Rhun dig themselves into a position which is a little bit exposed, then the Hwacha will be able to rain death down upon them. A very unique artillery piece in the sense that hits will not decimate individual units, but they will do a lot of damage across the entirety of an opponent's army, so the true extent of the damage that it does may often only be felt as the battle wears on and it becomes apparent how much loss the defenders may have taken. But positioning is something that can be used to blunt the effectiveness of the Hwacha, because it's not an accurate artillery piece by any means. More of the Nurad footmen here, we've got more nomadic warriors as well, so they have to of course dip into some of their nomad units in order to be able to pad out their numbers here. It's one of the main advantages they need to bring to bear on a map like this against a foe like this. So I certainly agree with the fact that at least some of them are going to be going far more numbers centric. More Brotherhood of the Axe and more upgraded Variag warriors as well. That armour upgrade will help them when it comes to slogging through the battlefield. Interesting to see the Wind Blades can, of course, do have that extensive cavalry force, which is mostly nullified by the game meta as it stands at the moment, but their bodyguard cavalry is still very good, and the Wind Blades like this will also be a really good tool for preventing Rhun from sallying forth with their own cavalry to try and break up the Khandish advance. The Wind Blades also have the advantage of being incredibly fast as well as deadly to other cavalry in melee, so definitely agree with that pick. Standard nomadic marauders, cheap javelins like this, as we've often said time and time again in battles such as this in a siege setting, very, very useful. The defenders have to answer them somehow. Cavalry is the most efficient way of doing so, though it's not always possible. Archers will rip through them because they don't have that much armour, but they're so cheap. Do you want to be using valuable arrows on them? Or even crossbow bolts for a more extreme option. Standard nomadic raiders are a very cheap archer, but numbers may be everything in terms of Khan's attempts to win the skirmish fight against Rhun here. Combined with the tankier nomadic infantry you've already seen, it's a pretty good combination of units there, I'd say, for really trying to force Rhun onto the back foot in that regard, and TOL FALAS is open enough certainly for Khand to attempt that. And then another unit of Storm Guard, of course, very, very dangerous. The player who sent me this battle replay is going to be Fila here, playing as another of the Khandish forces. He's gone for some Variag bowmen, interestingly enough, which perhaps the closest thing to the Variag mercenaries that Khand may very well, or Rhun, sorry, may very well be depending upon in their defensive efforts. Kind of the midway archer unit really between the nomads and the nomadic infantry and the nomadic raiders that we've already seen. They're not quite as tanky as the infantry, but they're a better all-round unit certainly than the raiders, and I mean they're not quite as good when it comes down to getting involved in melee, but their main focus of course was always going to be at range anyway. More nomadic marauders, he's decided to go for far more halberds than Medexa, the last army that we saw. Plenty of Nurad footmen as well and nomadic infantry, so plenty of the Nurads here making up the vast majority of these armies, and they're a very dependable kind of unit, especially in this kind of situation, so it's understandable why that would be the case. More raiders and marauders. I did catch a quick glimpse, yes indeed, of the Brotherhood of the Spear, the most defensive of the Brotherhood units in comparison to that of the Axe. Obviously they've got a very large shield value. As spears they're going to be more defensive in nature anyway, so outlasting rather than outpacing is going to be the name of the game with this kind of unit, and Rhun don't really have a similar kind of unit on this tier. The Scion Rim are the closest thing, but they're not quite as strong, though they are the sort of thing that you can blanket your lines with a little bit more so. Variag warriors and more Storm Guard at the back. A couple more armies which are actually preparing, I think, to go over these bridges, but it's looking like, based on how Rhun are set up, we might not actually see this side of the battlefield used all that much. Ingemar has also brought some Nurad halberds. Nurad footmen are here. We can see more Brotherhood of the Shadow, so the assassins, again, difficult to use, but potentially really useful, especially in the very late game. Nurad Stormguard, of course, are going to be the centre of any Candish quality efforts that may be undertaken. Here we have the armour upgraded Variag Bowmen, so they're going to be even better in a skirmish fight. Probably the most efficient choice of unit, really, if Khand want to win a skirmish fight, more so than the Nomadic Infantry, which maybe are a bit overpriced for what they offer. But there are more Nomadic Infantry nonetheless. I mean, this is a very potent skirmish force in terms of winning an attrition war at long range here that Khand has decided to bring. So already Rhun may be on the back foot in that regard. Nomadic Marauders, and we've got Brotherhood of the Sword here, the final Brotherhood unit that we haven't seen as of yet because they're a little bit strange. They are technically a shock infantry or a more aggressive infantry unit because they lack a shield, but one of their main selling points is the fact they've got a lot of melee defense, so they're actually a more defensive unit in every regard other than dealing with arrow fire. And of course, when you're on the attack in a siege, there's going to be no avoiding arrow fire, so they're a bit of a strange one, but they've got the Brotherhood of the Axe and the Brotherhood of the Spear anyway, so it's not as if they've sacrificed one of the others to bring that one along. And then T.S. Niehoff has decided to bring Nomadic Marauders as well, a rundown of Nomadic Infantry, Footmen, got more Footmen in the distance, interestingly enough, Halberds, more Brotherhood units, Stormguard and Shadows. It is interesting to see this unit, as I see it in the distance, the Chieftain's Vanguard, probably the tankiest unit of horse archers in the game. And that may come into play, although I think I'd rather see another unit of Windblades just to really make sure that enemy cavalry can't get up to any sort of tomfoolery. But nonetheless, Chieftain's Vanguard does give them that mobility, and it does give them another archer unit by default, I suppose. Some unupgraded Variag Warriors, and some Bowmen and Raiders waiting to move forwards as well. On to the defenders then, we have the Rune Raider who's playing as one of the runic forces. A trio of Gamprim. We've already mentioned this. In comparison to the Nurad Halberds, I would give the slight edge to the Gamprim because they do have a slight shield value, albeit they're still going to be fairly vulnerable to arrow fire, but it is a nice little edge that they have maybe over such a similar unit from a similar faction. We've already mentioned the Scion Rim. Individually, they may not have quite the same edge as the Brotherhood of the Spear, but Rhun have got a lot of money to play with, so they can bring far more of the Scion Rim, and that's going to be one of the main bulwarks that their defence is going to be reliant upon here, you would suggest. E-Strong crossbows, which don't have the armour upgrade, but they don't necessarily need it. I mean, crossbows are the main thing, I would say, in this kind of scenario that Rhun have over Khand, that they really need to be using to its maximum if they're going to stand a chance of winning. So target selection going to be critical here, with Flagrim in and amongst, of course, doing the same job as the Nurad Footmen, though they sacrifice a bit more of a shield value, but they're maybe more of a well-rounded unit than the Nurads. We've got the Carmel's Chosen. I'm looking forward to the next patch for the Carmel's Chosen just because they look nicer in the next patch. They already look pretty regal here, but definitely a very fine-looking unit there indeed. But when it comes to bodyguard units, they do leave a little bit to be desired in comparison to the Stormguard. They're opposite numbers on the other side of the field today. They're much more run-of-the-mill, but even so, they're still very high quality, and it still will be a very important unit moving through the battle. Balkoth Tribesmen, again more of a regimented javelin unit here than the Nomadic Marauders. Positioning, they will have the advantage there, and it's another projectile type they need to be using well if they are to go on to win this battle. And they do have some aggressive cavalry. I mean, the Camul's Dragon Knights are a very, very deadly unit of knights. They need to be careful of the wind blades, but if they can be used effectively, and they may need to be because they're so expensive that if you decide to bring them, you kind of have to back yourself to use them appropriately. And Dragon's Wrath crossbows are in there as well. The body-piercing crossbow bolts, always very deadly indeed. Bard the Bowman, another runic force, and I imagine we're going to be seeing much the same sort of thing here. When Rhun have got a lot of money to spend, they're not going to deviate from a certain thing too much, with the Carmel's Chosen heading up the army. A huge array of Gamprim and Flagrim making up the front lines, with some Scion Rim mixed in there as well to be the solid front line. Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen. Interesting to see some fully upgraded E-Strong Clansmen. They're an efficient unit for their cost, but I think considering the level of quality on display today, they're really going to be more of a meat shield than anything else. He has decided to upgrade his E-Strong crossbows, so if Khand do want to skirmish with them, they've got to make it through that extra metal layer. Already mentioned briefly the Variag Mercenaries with their armour upgrade as well. They will be going back and forth with their brethren from the east, so they have decided to be loyal to gold rather than their realm. And the Dragon's Breath, so positioning, I mean morale is also something that the Dragon's Breath can do a horrible amount of damage to. And then last but by no means least, we have Tommy the Wise. So he didn't send me this one, but he has been sending me an awful lot of battles recently, so nice to see him again. Dragon's Wrath crossbows once more. Just a little further back, I would imagine we're going to be seeing much the same sort of thing. Scion Rim, upgraded crossbows, Gamp Rim, Camul's Chosen at the centre of his army. More Gamp Rim, plenty of Gamp Rim here. So, I mean, they do have the edge here of the enemy faction not having pikes either, so their front line is going to be spared that, though arrow fire maybe less so. Scion Rim, Flag Rim, more upgraded crossbows. In and amongst the trees we've got more Flag Rim. And at the top of the hill over here we have some Gnar Rim as well, the first example of this kind of unit. They of course have got their flaming projectiles. We cannot see any Carmel Shadow Guard or Shadow Bows, the Rangers of course, but I would be very surprised if we saw none of those units, especially the Rangers, given how important they tend to be for the defenders in 5v3s like this. But I'll make a cut here because I have a feeling that we're going to be seeing a little bit of marching by the blue team and indeed the red team to set themselves up in position in beyond this village and set up on that hill over there. Maybe the less common side of TOL FALAS for the defenders to gather, but that's interesting, so we'll see who wins this night. So I think we will rejoin here even though blows have not been struck, because I'm not entirely certain what this cavalry is going to do. It's a bit risky from Medexa to do this because, as you can see, the rest of the runic army is moving over there, but it would only take one unit of infantry or cavalry to completely cut off this unit of Nurad Windblades and render them effectively harmless, although what the presence of this Windblades does do is make the passage of Wundrader's runic army a little bit more treacherous, but I think that would only be useful if Khand can cover the ground quickly enough to get over here, which I don't think is ultimately going to be the case, but we'll see. The Dragon Knights are leading the way, so at the very least no charges are going to be forthcoming onto that runic army. Even if the Dragon Knights would technically lose to the Windblades 1-1, they would certainly give them a very good fight, and it will protect some of their squishier infantry units from taking some very unneeded damage in the earlier stages of this game. Rhun, after all, this is going to be a fairly tricky encounter for them. 5v3s always are, and Khand are quite an awkward faction to deal with actually, when you consider some of their strengths, and we've already mentioned the fact that they've brought a lot of their archers today, and it is an area where they will hold a little bit of an advantage over Rhun. Rhun are going to have to depend on more specialty projectiles like crossbow bolts, I think, if they are to have a victory here. Stuff like rangers as well, which of course Khand do not have access to. The Windblades continuing to just sort of get in the way, make life a little bit more awkward. And I do believe, as long as the YouTube compression doesn't absolutely demolish the lighting, the darkness shouldn't prove to be too much of a problem actually. Probably the first night battle that I've shown where the visibility is not horrendous, which is interesting. Man of Warriors leading the way, so they are slowly moving forward. The Hwacha is also there. I think the presence of the Hwacha does actually make the decision to move over here a little bit wiser. In order for the Hwacha to get into range of the back hill, after all, it will need to plant itself firmly in harm's way of all of those missiles up there, whereas if they did the normal thing on TOL FALAS and set up along the high ground over there on that hill, they would be horribly exposed and the Hwacha would not need to get in range of any of the archers. I do believe I've jumped the gun a little bit though, in terms of rejoining the battle, if I'm being honest, considering the fact that those Windblades don't actually appear to be doing much of anything. They're hovering, loitering with intent, but not really. Are we going to see an engagement between these two cavalry units? We might. Menacing one another. There we go. What on earth is going on here? It's almost as if they're expecting the, as soon as the grace period is over, the cavalry will clash, and without enough room to build up a charge, it will only further enhance the Windblade's advantage in this particular duel. Dragon Knights going backwards. What utterly bizarre starts the fight. I mean, this is obviously all part of the grace period, but should probably have done my usual thing of waiting for the first casualties to be inflicted. Speaking of which, are we actually going to see a battle now? The lances are down. The swords are drawn, and yet so far no bloodshed. Although I do believe I did see some arrows from on high. Try to get rid of the wind blades, but again, Rhun dug into the settlement. They are going to at least hold the streets for a little bit. Try and keep those archers in a good position to utilise. And it's from this point on where I really think grace periods need to end. As soon as the defenders are in a sort of shape where, realistically speaking, they're now together, that's when I think the gloves should come off, so to speak. As much as I do want Rhun to have the best chance possible moving forwards in this fight, it is something to bear in mind in the future. So far, just nomadic warriors moving forwards. So we're still on times 6 speed. I mean, it is a huge Khandish force making its way forwards. Khand do have those numbers. A lot of the evil men factions do have a tendency to pack those on. And especially with more of an emphasis on these nomadic units, they're certainly not going to be wanting for manpower. Interesting choice to have the Eastron crossbowmen out in front. Something that's easily changed, of course, but still. Very much in place now. I mean, I guess it is up to Khand now when they decide to move forwards. And what they decide to lead with. I'd be very surprised if they didn't lead with some basic archers and maybe probing the front line a bit with just some basic nomadic units to get things underway. The strong clansmen against nomadic warriors. Interesting little battle that. The armour upgrade should give the edge to the runic militia there. And thought about moving forward, but we're still waiting for the battle to get underway proper. Starting to poke their heads a little bit further into the... here we go. And the nomadic raiders do open up, so unsurprisingly they are going to be setting forth with some basic archers, and I don't really know what Rhun are going to do in order to prevent this kind of tactic. In a 5v3 this is so effective just because over time you either end up doing a fairly decent amount of damage with some very low tier archers, or the enemy have to utilise their valuable ammunition, which they need to utilise to a far greater extent than you do as the attackers. And that means that your infantry and your numbers should be able to carry the day in melee, so it's a nice and easy opener for any attackers in a 5v3. Should the map be a little bit more open, which FALAS is, it does have some good choke points to hold on to, which Rhun will be dependent upon, but it isn't one of these maps that makes it difficult for the attackers to arc their shots. Variag mercenaries taking some initial hits. I am surprised that Rhun haven't taken the bait anywhere really in the battle so far, as Flaming Shot also starts streaking through the sky. Scion Rim combined with Gamp Rim, and moving backwards, really the best they can do. I think their best bet will be to try and coax Khand further into the settlement so that their archers up on the hill can start to pick and choose their targets. Not necessarily the archers that are firing at them now, but if the infantry can come a little bit further forward. Nomadic Marauders also on the way forward. This is a particularly dark section of the map. Interesting shadows. Dragon Knights, and I do question they had to know, based on the fact that they willingly chose this side of the settlement, what they were going to be doing. They were going to be banking up and playing very, very defensively. Dragon Knights, they kind of have to be used late game in this sort of situation. If you want to play really defensively and dig in, you're not going to have the movement, nor the map control, nor the space to be able to use cavalry more freely, especially not when Khand have decided to bring melee cavalry of their own. So you're going to have to bide your time until the late game, maybe hope that hammer and anvil strikes can be a bit of a match winner for you. Still a flurry of arrows coming in, and as I mentioned, it doesn't really matter too much what the attackers decide to target. Of course, there are better choices here and there. I mean, if you can target down the Gamp Rim, that would certainly be preferable to many of the other choices, but as long as they're doing damage to the defenders, it's not the sort of thing that they can sustain for a huge amount of time. Javelins are also now close enough to the point where they're in range and going after a pretty strong unit in the Scion Rim as well. We are seeing, well, we threatened there a melee engagement, but with halberds and with infantry in the numbers that they're in, and also with how exposed this section of the settlement is to those javelins, I think Rhun did the right thing by pulling back just a little bit. They have moved their Scion Rim back in, but again, I don't think this is a particularly great engagement for them. They've already taken a little bit of damage from those javelins. The armour piercing on the Nurad footmen will also do decently against these heavy spears. The Scion Rim are a very elite unit, but they are on their lonesome here against units that can chip through that heavy armour they wear a little bit more effectively. Nomadic warriors moving a little bit further forward. You can see that really the vast majority of the casualties inflicted so far have been runic ones, and so far so good as far as the use of the basic archers and the basic javelins go, although this is going to be a little bit of a sore one for those nomadic marauders sent forward unsupported, and good opportunistic charge there from the Carmel's Dragon Knights, and they're going to continue to move forward because the support is pretty far away. Nihoff dragging his heels a little bit with some infantry support, and while nomadic marauders, individually speaking, are not the most devastating unit in the world, that sort of thing will add up, and it's the sort of victories that Rhun need to be seeing a little bit more of. Chieftain's Vanguard firing away, a little bit more punch to their individual projectiles, even if there aren't quite so many of them, but so far, over here, not a huge amount of damage done so far. The runic shields are pointing in the right direction. It will be doing damage over time, like I said though, so the attackers won't be too concerned by the slightly lower volume of kills that we've seen thus far from them. A little bit of a disjointed defence this from Rhun. I mean, they've covered their angles, but they want to be very, very careful, because if you start to see surrounds within the settlement that Khand are able to do with infantry, again, that's the sort of thing that Rhun can ill afford. Moving further into this battle, Scion Rim now leaving. Over here, more pressure being put on. You can see in the background there those Eastron crossbows being targeted. They do have the armour upgrade, you can see even from all the way back here. But they're still a very, very juicy target for the Khandish archers. The Nurad struggling a little bit more now that the Scion Rim are being backed up by Gamprim, so no longer can they simply rely on the Halberdier unit to do the business, but Khand, of course, this is the theme with many a 5v3. Khand can simply commit more units of varying levels of quality, and they can sustain an assault for a fairly long time, and it needs to be Rhun doing a lot of damage, and I think this is more of a rear guard than anything else. You can see Tommy the Wise is actually moving more of his units back. This will plug the gap for a while, but it is also a sign that Rhun should be thinking about doing this en masse, because if Tommy the Wise isn't going to hold on over here, then the opportunity may knock for Khand to get those surrounds off that I mentioned, nomadic warriors I should say, moving forward to try and take some map control within this settlement, but maybe getting a little bit too far ahead of themselves, sandwiched as they were there between a charge from the Dragon Knights and the solid surface that is the Scion Rim. But Scion Rim themselves find themselves in danger of getting surrounded now, which may have been the plan from the nomadic warriors all along, but I don't necessarily know if the nomadic warriors are going to stick around too much if the Dragon Knights continue to charge into them. The Windblade's trying to do the same, but the Scion Rim represent a far greater threat to them than the nomadic warriors do to the Dragon Knights. Still, nice to see the cavalry is being used proactively by both sides, trying to make use of a slightly more risky unit type for both sides in a siege. Certainly if the attackers can use cavalry like that in a 5v3 well, it piles so much more pressure onto the defenders. Again, this is the kind of damage I really don't think Rhun can afford to just swallow like that. Brotherhood of the Shadows using their throwing projectiles and doing a decent amount of damage there to a unit of Flag Rim. Looks like they have run out of ammunition. Assassin class units don't have the most ammo after all, but they're perfectly capable in melee as well. Very high melee defense, so not the sort of thing, honestly, that mace men are going to be particularly great at dealing with one-to-one, but Rhun do have more support. We're starting to see an engagement over here as well, and fairly hefty engagement as well, with Brotherhood of the Axe leading the way. Nomadic Raiders simply here for numbers' sake, having utilised all their ammunition already in the initial volleys that were loosed Starting to see a bit more from Rhun's projectiles returning fire as well, going after nomadic marauders of Ingamar's army. So far, Rhun holding, but it really just depends on how long those Brotherhood of the Axe can stay alive. Because as long as they stay alive, it is a nasty damage spike for that runic infantry to have to try and deal with. Once again, the nomadic marauders making a nuisance of themselves, and starting to see perhaps the evidence over here as well that it's not necessarily infantry surrounds they're getting, but they are able to shoot into the backs of some of Rhun's lines with some of their archers, which will take the shield out of the equation. A few more kills, just that little bit more efficiency. Things are looking fairly good for the attackers so far, you'd have to say. Fairly by the numbers kind of siege, and when you bring this kind of army, that's always the way you want to play it. Play the percentages. For Rhun, they're going to be reliant on some a bit of individual brilliance from some units like Camel's Shadow Bows, I think. Rhun are now moving back further. I do like the fact that Rhun at the very least did make the attempt to hold on to the settlement. It hasn't gone particularly well for them, you'd have to say. The retreat has also been a little bit disjointed, and kind of tried to exploit that where they can. Nomadic raiders firing away. Plenty of bowmen still, and plenty of ammunition to be utilised as well. So Canned not changing tactics. Don't change something that's still working after all. Continuing to push Rhun back and continuing to do damage from afar. Rhun are future-proofing a little bit. You can see that they are going to try and set themselves up on that hill. We may very well see the Hwacha be fairly decisive late on, though like I said, at least on this side of the map, Rhun have got the opportunity to shoot it with archers. Brotherhood of the Sword moving forward in the vanguard now to try and overrun the few Scion Rim that remain holding this street. Further afield, Norad Halberd's victory seems certain, so once again these runic forces that have been left behind to cover the retreat, they're holding on, but they're not really getting any sort of value here. The value will have to come later. Whether or not the decision to retreat will pay off or not remains to be seen. Chieftain's Vanguard are waiting as well, another unit of cavalry, not necessarily as dangerous as the Windblades. Horse Archers' charge bonus is very, very low, but at the very least, perhaps more mass to be utilised late on. Rhun completely destroyed now here, nomadic marauders moving forward. Nothing remains of the runic forces over here, though they've already retreated, so Rhun, at the very least, salvaging what they can, but that was never going to be an option for that particular unit of halberdiers and infantry. Getting completely overrun. Over here, the Scion Rim still holding on. I mean, they can have their morale broken, as you can see, but considering the scale of the odds against them, it is fairly impressive that they haven't already broken and fled. Of course, as soon as I say that they do, but held on for a decent amount of time there. War horns blaring in the distance. This is a fort that can be occupied, but Rhun have elected not to do that, and there is no real benefit for Canned doing so now. Windblades leaving. The runic infantry line looks pretty solid, doesn't it? Flag Rim once again with Gamprim in behind, but Canned in no rush to engage line to line just yet. This is the danger, of course. I did mention the fact that you don't really want to be using high value projectiles from a defending perspective against something, especially like Variag Bowmen. With those little bucklers they have, they're a very, very efficient unit of archers when they do this. Nomadic infantry, very, very similar in that regard as well, but doing nothing to counteract the Candish archer threat is also a problem. Cavalry is one way that you can try and do so, but on a more constricted map like this, that is dangerous. They did manage to get a decent little charge there into the Variag Bowman, but the close proximity of the Norad Halberdiers means that Filler is not going to be making that misstep again, you would suggest. they really have been hounding the crossbows that Tommy has decided to bring to the battlefield as well. I mean, they're going after the Dragon's Wrath, which, I mean, in all fairness, they represent such a threat, probably the single greatest threat to the Candish efforts to win this battle from here. So it is worth trying to gun them down from afar, but they will take a lot of damage, well armoured for a runic unit and multiple HP of course, so... And I think he has finally been coaxed into utilising some of his ammunition. I mean, this is one of the things we highlighted right at the very beginning. If Rhun are to be victorious, it will have to be on the back, at least partially, of their crossbows. Choosing the right kind of targets to deploy that stopping power on will be vital. And a little bit of a counter-attack there. The Flagrim not going to allow the Nomadic Marauders to simply have it all their own way. This other unit of Flagrim colliding with the Nurad front line as well. But this is the problem that Rhun have. They're so... Usually, what they find so dependable is that Flagrim, Gamprim combination on the front line. Nice amount of armour piercing. Good anchor. But it's exactly the same thing that Khand are also good at. Nurad Footmen and Nurad Halberds. Like I said, if I were to give the edge to one or the other in terms of dealing damage, Rhun would have the slight edge. But I do think overall the bigger shield value of the Nurad Footman in this kind of situation really does help them out quite a lot. Nurad Footman over here, still some Gamprim. More Flagrim on the way forwards as well. Nurad Windblades actually able to get in behind the lines, which is a little bit unfortunate. This is where their greater speed is going to help them out. The Dragon Knights will not be able to catch them easily. And they do charge through the Dragon's Wrath Crossbowmen. Once again, the Dragon's Wrath Crossbowmen can look after themselves in melee with those curved two-handed swords that they wield. And yeah, Windblades do rout now. They're right next to bodyguard tier units being hounded by knights. Not too surprising, that. Flagrim seeing the still Khand looping some shots into the runic lines. Less going on over here, you'd have to say. But then Tommy's front line is also a little bit further forwards, so I don't think this is a bad thing that the attackers are doing, trying to deal with this first and then hit the hill with everything they have, try and break the runic resolve in that way. And those Dragon Knights, those Nurad Footmen are shaken, and more charges like that could very well do the business. There's Chieftain's Vanguard are in here as well. They won't enjoy being hunted down by the Dragon Knights either, but it is interesting that these cavalry units have managed to slip the net, so to speak. Trying once again to charge into the Dragon's Wrath crossbows, though this probably is going to be the end of the Chieftain's Vanguard as well, in pretty much exactly the same circumstances as the Windblades, but it's worth a go. High value target they're trying to go after, trying to do damage to the supporting tools. Nomadic Marauders do manage to get a volley off there, which is pretty surprising. The Flagrim, I mean, I suppose like Tommy has got a lot to deal with over on the other side of the fortress, but those are the sorts of things which, again, more damage adding up upon the runic lines. Over here you can see those archer positions. I mean, this is why as well perhaps Khand were trying to put off advancing down this particular lane, because that position, for those positions for those runic archers, is going to be the sort of thing which will certainly make up some of the ground that Rhun lost in the settlement. Whether it'll be enough to do so in its entirety, we shall have to wait and see. Flagrim and Clansmen, and the Nomadic Warriors joining some of the Brotherhood units there. Once again, it's going to really be the slow build-up of damage that the archers are going to be doing, which I would be concerned about. Oof. Sort of thing which is difficult to keep track of over the course of the battle. That, however, far more straightforward. So the artillery from on high, the Dragon's Breath, thudding into that front line, and of course it can play havoc with morale, and Khand are by no means one of the most mentally resilient factions in the game, especially when they're more reliant on nomadic units playing the percentages with their lower end forces. There are the Carmel's shadow bows revealing themselves. I mean, there is a lot over there from a Candish perspective, so perhaps it's worth the risk, but as soon as they pop up, of course, all of those Candish archers are going to do their best to scythe them down as quickly as they possibly can. But they have done a lot of damage over here. The combination of the Eastron crossbows, the shadow bows, I don't know whether the Dragon's Wrath crossbows have utilised a huge amount of their ammunition. I know they used a volley or two, but they have managed to effectively stop Canned for the moment. Dragon's Wrath crossbows firing in there as well. This is a little bit more of a problem though. Rhune's starting to struggle a little bit more in terms of numbers over here, and if this part of the line is lost, then it does kind of expose that area behind the fort where Tommy's actually doing quite well, so he's going to need to commit more men forward if he is to continue doing what he's doing. This does mean, however, that they aren't having to hold the hill from numerous angles, and that does mean that Rhun can still concentrate fire into this one blob of infantry over here, and they are getting good value off them, obviously committing forward stuff like the halberds, like a red rag to a bull. That will be to those archers up on the hill. They will continue to fire as a result of having that kind of target placed in front of them. And front line continuing to do their work. Shadow bows do go back into hiding there, but a few stray shots that are going after the Eastron crossbowmen actually doing the business there as well. They do manage to break through that one unit of Flag Rim, the Dragon's Breath hitting the units, and enough to cause a little bit of panic among the nomadic infantry. Projectile bouncing up and hitting the corner of the fort. They do have more infantry here, but whether they have enough to actually cover all of the angles and prevent Canned from finding gaps, I don't know. Brotherhood of the Sword getting a little bit far ahead of themselves perhaps, and the Dragon Knights once again with a good opportunistic charge. Mechanical clank of those crossbows. The Balkoth Sapphire Bladesman in a good position as well, so certainly this defensive position has treated Rhun far better than the initial street fighting in the settlement. Able to utilise their own supporting units far more effectively. And those Dragon Knights have actually been an ever-present throughout this battle as well, and Woundraider has made very good use of them, I'd have to say. Dragon's Wrath crossbows now out of ammunition by the looks of things and joining in melee. So the fact they're out of ammunition may worry Rhun a little bit, and the fact that Canned still able to find yet more reserves of ammunition to fire at Rhun. Very depleted unit of crossbows. DPS isn't going to be their friend anymore, but at the very least they can continue to shoot. And Rhun will need every last crossbow bolt to find its mark over here, because Canned are gaining ground and they are starting to bust through sections of the line, which is a bad sign when you start to be on the inside of that crescent moon shape. It's a sign that you're being overrun. So they definitely have a shelf life that is rapidly nearing its end there on that front line Rhun, and more as well over here. So far the infantry is holding up, but somewhere Rhun are going to start to falter, and that may very well start the domino effect of Canned seizing back the momentum in this fight. More archers doing their thing, more Variag bowmen. Nomadic marauders trying to make a nuisance of themselves. They have ammunition, so they're just going to get in the way. Flag Rim will fairly easily deal with them in melee, of course, but they're just here to make the fight messy. Camille's Shadow Guard charging downhill, in addition to some Variag mercenaries helping to shore things up, so the initial line of runic infantry is starting to falter a little bit. There's a lot of nomadic axemen routing. And those fire arrows from the Nar Rim certainly doing their job as of right now. Things are looking certainly far better for Rhun now than they were initially. Still got it all to do though. Battles like this in a 5v3 can turn around on a dime, and that will be what Khand are hoping for. More arrow fire coming in. Dragon Knight's still reasonably healthy, you'd have to say. Flag Rim dealing with what remains of those nomadic marauders just in time to meet the advance of the Nurads. Maceman to Maceman. There goes one of the defending generals. Tommy's general perhaps has fallen. And considering what's happening over here now, Khand able to break through that defensive position, and it's going to be a little bit more desperate for Rhun now. Especially when you start to see stuff like Nurad's Storm Guard leading the way. Rhun don't really have a unit which can go toe-to-toe with them. They'll have to be more reliant on dealing with them from afar, I think. Something like the Sapphire Bladesmen with their javelins, or even just the standard Balkoth Tribesmen, if you can get them into a good enough position. But this is where things might start to get a little bit ugly. It rather depends on how much manpower Khand have left over here, and by the looks of things it's enough, as long as they're willing to commit it forwards as and where they're needed. These strong crossbows, so you can hear the whistle of crossbow bolts. This is where Rhun will need to do an awful lot of damage pretty quickly. With stuff like Carmel's Chosen, they can hold the line for a decent amount of time, though not an indefinite span. Dragon Knight's still alive, although Stormguard may... It's tempting, I suppose, to try and charge into the Stormguard, especially if they're scattered, but obviously if it comes down to any length of time in melee, the Dragon Knights will start to get butchered. That's what you want to be doing, a double whammy of crossbow bolts and javelins raining down upon Villa's Stormguard there. It is a pretty messy engagement though, but we are starting to see maybe not a domineering surround from Khand, but we are starting to see elements of the runic line be compromised. They're just sort of throwing anything in they can to try and surround this front line, and they are seeing some success with elements of Rhun starting to break, even though in terms of actual warrior to warrior they could probably do decently here, but the shape of the engagement is certainly not on their side. Nomadic infantry moving forward, and this is where we don't get to see this class of unit utilised in this way all that often, I wouldn't say. Where they have used their ammunition and now they will be doing their second job, getting into melee, and this is where having a little bit more invested into your archers will help you, because they will give you that little bit extra when the time does come to utilise them in melee. Narim, on the other hand, maybe not quite so impressive in melee, but everyone needs to do their bit for Rhun now. That was a thud from the Dragon's Breath, and getting some hits right into the middle of that Khandish infantry there. Over here, meanwhile, the support of that Narim up on the hill has effectively stopped Khand dead in their tracks. They do need to engage at the very least, because otherwise, you know, that ammunition would have been utilised at some point eventually, and having some sort of unified assault across all of Rhun, forcing them to commit more infantry over here, is still ultimately doing a job. But it has to be elsewhere where Khand go on to win. The Flagrim and the Shadow Guard struggling a little bit to deal with the halberds, but it's not going to take too much from Rhun to tip that particular fight back the other way. But it is over here that things are far less clear. Khand certainly are making ground up, but can they continue with this level of progress as is needed? The banks of crossbows now. This could very well be where the situation gets a little bit ugly. The Hwacha now also in play. Good positioning that from Medexa actually, and doing exactly the right thing. When you can see an army blanketed all across a hillside like that, your chances of scoring some decent hits are fairly high, and the Hwacha doesn't necessarily need to be hyper efficient in the way the Dragon's Breath does, which is probably a good thing, because there's always an element of RNG to Medieval 2 siege weaponry, and when it comes to the Hwacha, that is probably the most apparent. as long as you fire it into the right sort of target, it can be, you kind of know what you're going to get from it, but you can't really target down individual units quite so easily. Still a lot of arrows coming in from Canned as well as those rockets, targeting the right sort of thing as well, going after the Shadow Guard. They won't enjoy being under arrow fire, and they do represent more of a threat in melee than many of the other runic units do, with that extra damage that they have. Yeah, and Rhun's starting to gain the upper hand over here once more. Can just need to stoke this engagement for a little bit longer, I think. And then over here with the crossfire they have set up with the artillery doing its thing in the background over here, they're going to be getting some friendly fire now, and they are actually causing their own men to become shaken. So that's maybe a little bit more concerning, but yeah, Can starting to look a bit menacing here. Managed to shore things up over here though, Rhun. A combination of Carmel's Chosen and more banks of halberds have stalled Can's progress through the middle, so it's not a universal sweeping attack from Can that has been successful. So there's hope for the Easterlings yet. Variad warriors. And Nomadic Axemen moving forward in higher numbers, as well as Variad warriors. That armour upgrade. These more entry-level heavy swordsmen have proven to be a pretty decent kind of unit recently, stuff like the Black Uruks and these Variag warriors. A pretty efficient unit in this kind of pure melee slog that they are finding themselves in. And once again, Rhun find themselves surrounded over here, a little bit more comprehensively this time. Oof. Brutal. It's a fairly big rout from Can, that, and once again, nomadic units struggling a little bit more so. So that what was a comprehensive surround is not so much anymore, and it is kind of interesting that it's now actually up the hill that Rhun are primarily having to fight. So it's a very chaotic engagement, which tends to favour the attackers with their numbers, but Rhun will just be happy that their units are no longer surrounded. One Dragon Knight remains, and some of the Candish units that had managed to get this far have been routed off, but the fact that that many Nurads were that far up the hill anyway is probably a bad sign. Carmel's Shadow Guard doing their best, but having to go up against Nurad Halberds and Nurad Storm Guard, so once again acting as a rear guard, and maybe we've seen that a few too many times from Rhun, having to fight a losing battle in too many areas. Canned moving forwards. It looks as though overwhelming force eventually applied over here. You can see Brotherhood of the Spear moving forward to consolidate all of Can's gains. Tribesmen victory is a distinct possibility. Having to throw tribesmen into the mix and just having a look further back. I mean, it's certainly not a limitless supply of manpower that Can have, but it's starting to look thin on the ground for Rhun. A last stand, but rangers and artillery, all things that can certainly give a victory to Rhun in this kind of situation. Certainly targeting down the right sort of things as well. Interesting that Storm Guard are the ones they've decided to commit forwards first, in full view of some Dragon's Wrath crossbows that do still have a bit of ammunition. As they continue to get gunned down. Burning building. More collateral from the artillery pieces, although that one probably from the Hwacha based on its position. Getting a little bit far ahead of himself here is John. His allies don't appear to be quite ready to mount the assault just yet. And what was a reasonably healthy unit of Nurad Storm Guard, Rhun will take heart from the fact that they've managed to dispatch them without too much drama. Brotherhood of the Sword moving forward as well. But again, John needs his allies to... There is an element that John maybe jumped the gun a little bit there, but his allies do need to hurry up as well, stop dragging their feet. There goes one of the Candish generals, which I believe is over here somewhere, under the trees. Indeed. Balkoth Sapphire Bladesmen certainly no slouches in melee, as they have proved, wielding those falxes with menace. But they are isolated from all their assistance, and eventually Cand will be able to overwhelm and kill them. Artillery. Hits. They're going to need more of that, Rhun. More of a comprehensive advance now, with lots of Neurad footmen, but the fact that so many of the runic crossbows, well, so many of the runic projectiles are still crossbow bolts, is going to take away from the effectiveness of the footmen slightly with those big shields of theirs. Crossbow bolts care little for such things. Going after nomadic infantry and more Neurad Stormguard. It is quite telling though that Can still have a bit of ammunition that they can utilise as well. Trying to use their own flaming shot. Going after E-strong crossbows. And this, I think, is ultimately going to be the problem. Rhun probably have the firepower, but they don't have enough infantry left anymore, I think, to truly challenge the overwhelming force that Can provide at this point, unless I'm missing something at the top here. I mean, Dragon's Wrath crossbows. The fact that all of these units still have ammunition, it's kind of the opposite problem that we see in many siege battles. Like I said, they've conserved their ammunition at the expense, really, of taking damage earlier on, and the fact they still have ammunition now, but not enough infantry to actually cover all of the angles to make sure that all of these projectiles can keep firing. It's maybe the lesson in over-caution, I guess, but it's hard to argue that they should have done the opposite, because time and time again we've seen defenders dump their ammunition into unworthy targets. It's all about that balancing act here. I do think Rhun have probably gone a little bit too far the other way on this occasion, but Quacha crew getting involved as well. Everyone picking up a weapon and trying to finish Rhun off. And just having a look at the percentages of kills, reasonably close. 6% only the difference. 6% of the Candish army come the end game, though, is probably going to look fairly substantial, but as I mentioned, Cand did go for a bit more of a numerous approach on this occasion. Shadow bows, firing away. Still stuff like Brotherhood of the Spear alive as well. I have to say, actually, without the Neurads, well, there's only one Neurad Stormguard remaining. Those Balkoth Sapphire Bladesmen have done a very, very good job at butchering their way through the Candish detachment that was sent to try and finish them. Not enough sent over here, not enough. Cand will have other things that they can commit, of course. 24 Neurad Stormguard, another unit of Sapphire Bladesmen in here. Only 10 of them remain, and they're in a pretty sticky spot, but they've proven themselves to be a fairly savage melee combatant, have they not? Backs to the wall as it has been. Variag mercenaries doing decently in melee for a time there, but with a charge coming in from the Neurad Stormguard and Brotherhood of the Axe, that was enough to finally rout them off. Unsurprisingly, yeah, this is where pretty much all of the Candish strength is now bound up in. There's Brotherhood units over here with some Stormguard at their heart. Another runic general falls. Just trying to get as many kills as they can with their projectiles to give one last spit in the eye. Inflate their kill counts a little bit, and why not? Rightly so. Although I don't know how much more. They'll probably get one more volley before they are demolished. E-strong crossbows, even with that armour upgrade, it Helps them a little in melee, but certainly not enough to make them stand-ins for dedicated infantry. Can's clean-up continues. Dragon's Breath crew, still alive down here. They managed to, well, some of them are still alive at the very least. They managed to hold out for a decent amount of time, but once again we're seeing that old theme of overwhelming force. And that will definitely be that for them. There goes another Candish general, and it is this one over here as well. The Brotherhood of the Spear, who were tasked with bringing down the Dragon's Wrath crossbows on their own for a time, and it wasn't going that well as you would expect, but now with some assistance from on high from the Brotherhood of the Axe, that will start to turn around the damage on them. Very nice. And the victorious Sapphire Bladesman on the way up here. That's the last of the runic generals. Though what they have left, other than the... Oh, there's some Neurad Stormguard up there, fighting at the very summit of the hill. This of course is not the version of the map where you can get over these hills. In fact, I think we only saw that update once, and then it just sort of vanished. But Moon Raider trying to secrete some of his Dragon's Wrath crossbows at the top of this hill, giving them another way to fall back and get a few more shots off, but the Stormguard were having none of it. Medexa not wanting to allow those Dragon's Wrath crossbows any more kills than they would have already got. Yeah, Shadowbow is broken, fighting to the death. Nothing remains of Rhun over here now. So the hilltop more or less secured. And that really does leave just this little pocket of resistance over here. While very little remains of the crossbows and the Sapphire Bladesmen. Only a fool could lose this battle. Are you quite sure? I'm not certain that is going to be the case. Yeah, routing. One Dragon's Wrath crossbow managed to escape from that encounter with the Stormguard. One of the Candish armies has been utterly vanquished. That's something at the very least. Sapphire Bladesmen, are they going to routes? I don't know if they're locked morale. I didn't think they were, but considering the fact they're still eager, yeah, okay. Bard the Bowman does admit. And that is the end of the battle. An interesting one, though like I said, it was always going to be fairly difficult, I think, for Rhun in this sort of situation. Cand knew exactly what they were doing, and when you go with that kind of tactic in a 5v3 on this kind of map, it's going to be hard to counteract, basically. And Rhun tried to counteract it in a different way than we normally see, I think. They tried to absorb a lot of those arrows that Cand were throwing at them pretty much throughout the entirety of the game, but it was a dangerous game to play because it just meant that ultimately you were hemorrhaging manpower slowly but surely over the course of the entire battle that you couldn't really afford to be losing, especially when you consider the kind of numbers that Cand were bringing to the table as well. It was a pretty decent effort though, with the artillery and the crossbows. Like I said, the fact late on that they still had a lot of ammunition left is a sign that they were maybe a little bit overcautious in that regard, Rhun. But I think ultimately it was probably a better idea doing that than just dumping all their ammunition early, because we've seen time and again that just simply doesn't work. And it's all about getting that balance right. Rhun may have gone a little bit too far the other way, but at the very least you could tell they were thinking about it. And that is ultimately the important thing, is it not? Let's see what did the damage then for the Candish armies. Nihoff's army, 123 on the Chieftain's Vanguard is not too bad. The rest of his army struggling a little bit more, but again, not terribly surprising. I mean, after all, it is a difficult situation for the attackers to actually get high numbers consistently across their army. Brotherhood of the Axe we saw do pretty well. Nomadic Infantry, Variag Bowmen, Brotherhood of the Shadows, all projectile units. One unit of Halberds also doing quite nicely. Filla's army, no units breaking 100, which is the obvious thing to note there. 82 by the looks of things is the highest on a unit of Nomadic Infantry again, so archers, but consistent numbers throughout his entire force there. Casualties inflicted here, again, only one, breaking 100, and it was the Watcher, which is kind of interesting. We didn't see it used that much, but clearly in that time, while it wasn't doing a lot of damage to an individual target, it was doing damage overall. And again, Brotherhood of the Axe, so those heavy axemen really doing the business in melee. And fairly consistent numbers all round from the archers, as you would expect, and that's really what won Can the battle here. A very solid and dependable tactic that they used overall, and in the end I think they were good value for the win. It's a puzzle that the defenders always have to try and work out, and on this occasion they weren't quite able to do it. But a big thank you to, I think it was NIGHTFALL that sent me this battle. I can't actually remember. Yeah, but many of these players have sent me battles in the past, so it could have been conceivably any of them, other than the runic ones, obviously. But yeah, big thank you to all the players that were a part of this battle replay. Probably the only nighttime battle that has been somewhat visible, so that's at least somewhat atmospheric as well. As for what's going to be coming up next, I do have quite a few replays still to get to. This is the first one that I'm recording in 2023, by the way. So this is a couple of weeks after I did a recording session last. So again, nice to be back and doing this. But yeah, I can't actually recall what the very next one that I was going to do is. I think I've got a custom scenario, kind of similar to the Troy one that we did in the very last part. But we'll see. I can't quite recall. Plenty to be getting on with though. At some point this month we may very well end up doing the Sword Cavalry Knockout Tourney as well, considering that's kind of the last one of those to do, and it rounds it off really quite nicely. And yeah, looking forward throughout the rest of 2023, as I've already mentioned, it's going to be a little bit of upheaval going on. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.